Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Glad to be here.
I'm just so thrilled to have you with us today because we have a custom-tailored deep dive lined up for you.
Yeah, and we've been handed a really dense, honestly fascinating stack of source material today.
We really have, and the core tension we are looking at today revolves around a massive, basically an almost invisible assumption that governs modern society.
Right. It's the assumption that private markets are inherently more efficient than public institutions.
Exactly. For the last half-century, entire societies have basically taken that as a given.
Yeah, it's treated less like an economic theory and more like a law of gravity.
But the question we are asking today is what actually happens when essential systems, things that were explicitly designed for collective welfare, like our health infrastructure, our water systems, education, what happens when they are fundamentally rebuilt around profit incentives instead?
It's a huge shift.
It is. And before we get into the mechanics of that, there is an important note we really need to make about the source material you've shared with us.
Yeah, we should clarify this up front.
The analysis here heavily critiques specific political figures and administrations. We're going to be talking about the strategies of right-wing figures like Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, as well as left-wing figures like Bill Clinton.
And we want to be absolutely clear with you, the listener. Our goal in this deep dive is not to endorse these critiques politically or to take a partisan side.
Right.
We are entirely focused on impartial analysis. The purpose here is purely to look at the systemic and institutional mechanics that govern these public-private transfers.
We are examining the engine under the hood, regardless of which political party happens to be in the driver's seat at any given moment.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to even begin understanding how privatization restructures our world, we first have to agree on what a public good actually is.
And that's where things get complicated.
Yeah, looking at the research, there is this massive fundamental distinction between the way a strict economist defines the world and the way a functioning democracy defines the world.
That distinction is really the bedrock of this entire conversation. If you open a standard introductory economics textbook, you will find a highly technical, very narrow definition of a public good.
Right.
Economists define it as a good that is both non-excludable and non-rivalrous.
Okay, let's break those terms down for a second. Non-excludable essentially means it's practically impossible to stop someone from using it, right? Like you can't realistically put a toll booth on the air we breathe.
Exactly. And non-rivalrous means that one person consuming the good doesn't reduce the amount available for someone else.
Got it.
The classic textbook examples are a lighthouse or national defense. If a lighthouse beam guides my ship safely to shore, it doesn't diminish the light available for your ship. According to traditional free market theory, the market cannot easily figure out how to exploit these specific types of goods for profit. Profit relies on the ability to exclude people who don't pay.
And it relies on rivalry, on scarcity.
Precisely. Therefore, the strict economic theory argues that government should only be allowed to step in and provide a good when the market experiences a failure to monetize it.
Which, if you pause and really think about it, is a pretty wild way to organize a society.
It really is.
It basically puts the market in the driver's seat of determining what is public and what is private. It suggests that if some clever venture capitalist can figure out how to slap a toll on a lighthouse or put a turnstile on a sidewalk, suddenly it's not a public good anymore.
And the government should just step away.
Right. But the historical record presented in these sources argues for a much broader and, frankly, more democratic definition.
What's fascinating here is that historically, public goods were not defined by market failures. They were defined by shared civic values.
Values, not just economics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If we look back at the development of modern democratic societies, things like public water infrastructure, public schools, public parks, they didn't emerge just because the market couldn't exploit them.
Because it is entirely possible to exclude people from schools.
Oh, very easy. It is very easy to exclude people from roads, too. We could easily put a toll at the end of every single neighborhood block.
Or demand a credit card before a child walks into a kindergarten classroom.
But society explicitly chose not to do that.
Right.
Early democratic societies made a conscious collective value judgment. They decided that ensuring a baseline of survival, education, and public health for everyone was more beneficial to the collective whole than allowing the market to dictate access based on wealth.
It was a choice.
Yes, public goods in this framework are things we decide should be available to all, simply by virtue of living in the society.
And the historical data backing this up is staggering. Think about the massive expansion of public waterworks in the United States from the 1890s through the 1940s.
It was a huge undertaking.
By 1960, the U.S. had built over 20,000 water systems, and 83% of them were publicly owned.
83%.
That wasn't just some administrative accident. That was a monumental collective achievement driven by a very harsh reality. If your neighbor's water is infected with cholera, you are not safe either.
No matter how much money you have in the bank.
Exactly. Public health practically demanded public infrastructure.
And that infrastructure was financed and built through generational public investment. People paid taxes to lay pipes and build reservoirs, essentially paying it forward so that the next generation would have clean, safe, reliable access to the fundamental stuff of life.
The design of the institution was rooted in universal access.
But this brings us to the fundamental shift in design that occurs with modern privatization. And we need to clarify what we mean when we use that word, because it's often conflated with simple outsourcing.
Right, let me play devil's advocate for a moment here. If my city decides they need a new public library, the mayor doesn't hand out hammers and nails to the city council members. They hire a private construction firm to build the building. Isn't that privatization? Why is that a problem?
That is a great distinction to make. Hiring a private firm to build the library is just procurement.
Procurement.
The public still owns the library. The public sector still decides what books go inside. They decide the hours of operation, and they ensure that anyone in the city can walk in and read a book for free.
So the ultimate authority and accountability remain in the hands of democratic governance.
Exactly.
So what are we actually talking about when we talk about the systemic privatization detailed in these sources?
The privatization we are analyzing today is a much deeper structural transformation. It is the fundamental transfer of control, ownership, accountability, and decision-making power out from under public oversight.
And into the hands of private corporate governance.
Right. When you fully privatize a system, you are taking a public good that was designed and governed by the need for universal access, and you are handing it to a private entity that is legally governed by the requirement to maximize shareholder profit.
You're changing the very DNA of the institution.
They really are.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you transfer that control, you aren't just changing the name on the door, you are introducing an entirely new set of incentives into the system.
And incentives drive behavior.
Exactly. Let's dive into the specific mechanics of modern privatization, specifically this concept that comes up constantly in the research, the public-private partnership, or P3.
Right, the P3.
On the surface, P3 sounds like a fantastic collaborative concept. The public sector and private innovators holding hands, skipping into the sunset, building a bridge together.
It is a brilliant piece of branding.
It really is.
Partnership implies equal footing and shared goals. But to understand how these actually function, we have to examine what the sources call the financing hinge.
The financing hinge. Let's break that down.
This is where the mechanics of capital completely alter the trajectory of public goods. Let's look at how large-scale infrastructure is traditionally built. If a city needs a new bridge or a massive overhaul of its water system, it requires a huge amount of capital up front. Historically, a government would raise that money by issuing a tax-exempt municipal bond.
Because governments are generally very safe bets. They can always raise taxes if they need to.
Exactly. So they can borrow money at incredibly low interest rates. Historically, we're talking about borrowing at less than 4%.
So the city borrows the money at 4%, they build the bridge, the public gets to use the bridge, the bondholders get a safe, predictable, albeit low, return on their investment over 20 or 30 years.
And crucially, the public retains total control over the asset.
Right. But in a public-private partnership, the private entity enters the picture, acting less like a construction company and much more like an investment bank.
Yes, a multinational conglomerate or a massive private equity firm approaches a city government, often a government that is politically terrified of raising taxes or issuing new debt.
And they make a very seductive offer.
They do. They say, we will give you a massive pile of cash up front to fix your roads or upgrade your water systems. You don't have to float a bond. You don't have to raise taxes today. We'll take care of the financing, the maintenance, everything.
Okay, but again, looking at this from the perspective of a cash-strapped mayor, why shouldn't they take that deal?
It looks tempting.
If a private equity firm is willing to drop $1 billion on my city's desk to fix the potholes, on paper, That sounds like a massive win for the taxpayer.
It looks like a win until you look at the cost of capital and how it changes institutional behavior.
Ah,
A private equity firm or a multinational infrastructure consortium does not borrow money at 4%. They are beholden to institutional investors who expect a 10 to 20% return on their investment.
wow. 10 to 20%.
That massive gap between the 4% municipal rate and the 20% private equity rate has to be paid for by someone. That profit has to be extracted from the system.
And suddenly, the institution's primary directive shifts from provide universal access to extract maximum profit and minimize cost.
Precisely. And furthermore, these contracts are masterpieces of risk transfer.
Risk transfer.
In a true partnership, risk is shared. But in these P3 agreements, the financial risks, like the cost of unforeseen environmental remediation or the burden of ensuring universal access to marginalized communities, are almost always pushed back onto the public sector.
While the revenues and profit margins are strictly guaranteed to the corporation through binding long-term agreements,
You got it.
let's ground this in some of the specific case studies from the research, because when you look at the actual infrastructure deals, the abstract math becomes very, very concrete.
The examples are striking.
Let's talk about the concept of asset recycling. That is a term that sounds incredibly eco-friendly, almost progressive.
It does sound nice.
But in the context of the Indiana Toll Road, it meant something entirely different.
Asset recycling is essentially a financial euphemism for leasing out existing public infrastructure for a one-time cash injection.
Right.
In the case of the Indiana Toll Road, the state government agreed to a 75-year lease with a consortium of foreign investment firms, specifically Macquarie from Australia and Sintra from Spain.
75 years. That means the politicians who signed the deal will be long gone, and potentially their grandchildren will be gone before the public regains control of that road.
Yes. And in exchange for handing over control of the toll road for 3/4 of a century, the state of Indiana received a $3.85 billion upfront payout.
Which, to a governor trying to balance a budget in an election year, looks like an absolute triumph.
It's a huge political win in the short term.
You get to cut ribbons on new localized projects using that $3.85 billion without ever raising a cent in taxes. But what did the analysis actually reveal about the long-term math of that deal?
The analysis showed that by giving up the right to collect those tolls for 75 years, the state essentially forfeited 4 to 5 times more revenue than the upfront payment they received.
4 to 5 times more.
If the state had simply kept the road public, incrementally raised the tolls themselves, and issued standard municipal bonds, they would have generated vastly more capital for the state over that same time period.
Instead, that future wealth was transferred to foreign investors.
Exactly.
It's essentially taking out a predatory payday loan, but using a massive piece of public infrastructure as collateral.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
But the loss of revenue isn't even the most restrictive part of these deals.
Yeah.
We need to talk about contract maximization.
Yes.
Because to protect that 10 to 20% expected return, these private corporations negotiate incredibly aggressive clauses into these contracts.
And this brings us to the absolute poster child for privatization gone wrong: the Chicago parking meters.
Let's get into it.
The Chicago parking meters deal is a masterclass in how democratic sovereignty is eroded by private contract law. In 2008, the city of Chicago leased its entire system of roughly 36,000 parking meters to a private consortium led by the investment bank Morgan Stanley.
Okay.
The city received an upfront payment of $1.15 billion. And again, this was a 75-year lease.
Just to put this in perspective for anyone listening, imagine you own a house in a busy neighborhood. You decide you need some quick cash, so you sell the rights to your driveway to a private company for a lump sum.
Right.
But buried in the contract is a clause that says every time you park your own bicycle in your driveway, or if you want to use your driveway to host a Saturday yard sale, you have to pay the company a massive fine for their lost potential profit.
Yes.
That is essentially the trap the city of Chicago walked into.
That analogy is spot on because the critical mechanism in the Chicago contract was the introduction of what are called compensation events.
Compensation events.
A compensation event is a contractual clause that forces the city to financially reimburse the private consortium if the city does anything, literally anything, that reduces the usage of the parking meters or the revenue they generate.
Which sounds vaguely reasonable if you are thinking purely in terms of a private business contract.
Like, you leased me this asset, you can't go breaking it.
Exactly. But When applied to a living, breathing, constantly evolving metropolis, it is a nightmare.
It completely paralyzes the city.
If the city of Chicago wants to close a street for a weekend street fair or a parade or a farmer's market, they can't just do it. They have to calculate the lost parking revenue for those specific hours and cut a check to the Morgan Stanley Consortium.
And it goes so much deeper than just parades and street fairs.
How so?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of urban planning and environmental adaptation, these compensation events act as a literal straitjacket on democratic governance.
Because cities aren't static.
Exactly. Cities are not static entities. They have to adapt to new technologies and new crises. The research notes that Chicago, like many modern cities, had long-term plans to build hundreds of miles of protected bike lanes.
Right.
They also wanted to introduce bus rapid transit lines to reduce traffic congestion and lower greenhouse gas emissions.
But building a dedicated bike lane or a bus lane almost always requires removing street parking.
Exactly. And because of the privatization contract, removing a parking meter triggers a compensation event.
Oh, wow.
If the city removes a meter to build a bike lane, they don't just lose the revenue. They have to pay the private corporation the projected lost revenue of that meter for the remainder of the 75-year lease.
Which makes the cost of building a simple bike lane astronomically high.
It effectively forces the city to abandon its own long-term environmental and transit planning.
Because the immediate financial penalty to the private corporation is just too steep to overcome. When you really analyze the mechanics of that, the public has literally lost sovereignty over its own streets. They cannot adapt to climate change, they cannot modernize their transit infrastructure, because an ironclad contract with an investment bank essentially forbids it.
The city planner's boss is no longer the mayor or the voting public. Their boss is the lease agreement.
This illustrates the fundamental, predictable outcome of this incentive architecture, the degradation of public goods and a massive financial extraction.
But alongside the financial extraction, there is a much deeper psychological shift occurring within the population.
A psychological shift.
Privatization actively and deliberately redefines our relationship to society and to each other. It takes citizens, people who share a collective burden and enjoy a collective benefit, and redefines them into consumers.
Consumers. Individuals who are conditioned to only care about their own transactional satisfaction.
Right.
That distinction between citizen and consumer is so vital to understand the crisis in perception here. If I'm conditioned to view myself purely as a consumer of city services, my only concern is whether I can personally afford the toll road or whether my individual water bill is low.
You're only looking at your own bottom line.
I don't particularly care if my neighbor can't afford the toll because, as a consumer, my responsibility is only to my own wallet.
But as a citizen, I recognize that if my neighbor can't afford to get to work, or if their water is contaminated, the entire community suffers.
The citizen mindset is rooted in reciprocity. The consumer mindset is rooted in isolation.
And nowhere is this clash between the consumer mindset and the citizen mindset more glaringly obvious or more dangerous than in the realm of public health.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources we are analyzing provide a truly harrowing analysis of the systemic outcomes produced by this mindset during the early response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Let's really dig into this because this isn't just theory. This is a systemic failure that cost lives.
It did.
During the early days of the pandemic, when uncertainty was at its absolute peak, the federal government's explicit stated strategy was to unleash the power of the private sector.
They attempted to handle a massive, coordinated national crisis through aspirational public-private partnerships.
They held press conferences with the CEOs of massive corporations, Google, CVS, Target, Walmart, and announced that these private retailers would magically solve the testing logistics.
Retailers would give up slivers of their parking lots for drive-through testing, and tech companies would build the triage websites.
But from a systems analysis perspective, this was a profound miscalculation of how private markets actually operate.
These grand partnerships failed to materialize quickly, and in some cases failed to materialize at all.
Why?
Because there was no immediate guaranteed profit mechanism for these companies to scale up massive coordinated public health interventions overnight.
Right.
The free market does not naturally coordinate for the common good. It is explicitly designed to optimize for individual corporate advantage.
And because the federal government refused to coordinate a public centralized response, for example, by fully utilizing the Defense Production Act to command supply chains, the system fractured.
States were thrown to the wolves.
They really were. They were forced into the open, unregulated market. They literally had to bid against each other and sometimes against the federal emergency management agencies just to secure life-saving equipment.
You had the governor of New York engaged in a bidding war against the governor of Louisiana for ventilators.
And we have to ask, what does a market do when demand spikes exponentially and supply is scarce?
It does exactly what it is designed to do. It raises prices to the absolute maximum the market will bear.
The cost of basic medical N95 masks jumped from 85 cents to $7 almost overnight.
The state of Louisiana found that the ventilators they desperately needed were suddenly 23% more expensive, and yet the exact same supplier was selling them to Washington State for a lower price because they negotiated a different contract.
There was no rational public health strategy dictating where the equipment went based on epidemiological need.
The equipment simply went to whoever could pay the highest extortionate price. This is the inevitable outcome when public health is treated as a consumer product.
And the testing debacle was arguably even worse in terms of exposing the flaws in this ideology.
Oh, the rapid test example.
Yes, the research highlights a specific instance where a private lab developed a rapid COVID test that could deliver results in just 5 minutes.
Which was game-changing technology in a moment when states had backlogs of over 100,000 patients waiting weeks for results.
Exactly. So what did the government do with this breakthrough? They ordered a measly 5,500 units.
5,500 for a country of over 300 million.
And the reason given wasn't a lack of production capacity. The official spokesperson explicitly stated that the government wanted to leave market share for hospitals and other healthcare providers to purchase through the commercial sector.
They prioritized preserving commercial market share over stopping a pandemic.
It's just wild.
This is the ultimate tragic culmination of treating a public good as a private commodity. It inevitably and mathematically creates exclusions.
Right.
If a rapid test or a ventilator goes only to the highest bidder in the commercial sector, it inherently means that someone else, a rural hospital that can't pay the markup, or a poorer state that is outbid, is excluded from survival.
A democratic system, however flawed, designs for universal access. A market system designs for exclusion based on purchasing power.
Exactly.
It's chilling when you lay the mechanics bare like that. And alongside this loss of universal access, privatization strips away another fundamental pillar of democratic governance, the right to transparency.
We lose our right to even know how the system is operating.
When a government runs a service, they are legally subject to freedom of information laws. As a citizen, you can demand to see the budget. You can look up the salaries of the administrators. You can request internal communications.
But when a private corporation takes over, suddenly everything vanishes behind a fortress of corporate secrecy.
We see this mechanism clearly in the example of Maximus Incorporated, a company that was instrumental in pioneering the privatization of welfare case management.
Right, the Connecticut contract.
They won a massive $15 million contract in the state of Connecticut to run a healthcare call center. A local public radio station submitted a very standard public records request to see the breakdown of the company's expenses.
They just wanted to know how the taxpayers' money was actually being spent.
What the journalists received back were pages and pages of completely redacted text, blacked out with a single legal stamp, trade secret.
Just imagine the audacity of that.
Yeah.
Your tax dollars are being spent to administer public health care, and when you ask for the receipt, the government tells you it's a trade secret.
How can a democracy function if it doesn't know how its own money is being spent?
It can't.
The sources also point to an entity called Job Ohio, which is a perfect example of this institutional shielding.
Job Ohio is fascinating.
The state government of Ohio created Job Ohio as a private economic development entity and handed them millions of dollars generated from the state liquor monopoly to incentivize job creation.
But because Job Ohio was cleverly structured as a private nonprofit corporation, they successfully fought in court to be shielded from public state audits.
And the political system actively aided that opacity. The governor at the time even rushed through specific legislation to ensure the state auditor couldn't look at Job Ohio's books.
Decisions about millions of dollars of public money were entirely removed from public scrutiny.
Now, this opacity is a natural reflex in the private sector. If you are a corporation manufacturing smartphones, you obviously don't want your competitors to see your supply chain costs or your internal memos.
Of course not. But when that exact same corporate logic is applied to the public sector, it breaks the democratic feedback loop.
It concentrates power in the hands of corporate executives and political appointees, completely severing the line of accountability to the voters. So, if you are listening to this, you're probably asking the same exact question I was when I first read through this stack of research. Why does this keep happening?
Yeah, if it fails so often, why do we keep doing it?
If the underlying mechanics are this flawed, if the roads get worse, the tolls get higher, the street fares are canceled, the pandemic response is fractured, and we aren't even allowed to look at the budget, why do politicians continue to sell off our public goods?
That is the pivotal question of this entire analysis. And the answer lies in understanding the deeply entrenched feedback loops that ensure this institutional system persists and reinforces itself.
Even in the face of glaring catastrophic failures.
Exactly. Privatization doesn't just happen once in a vacuum. It aggressively alters the political and economic environment in a way that creates demand for more privatization.
Let's map out those feedback loops because they are incredibly powerful. The first major loop the sources identify is the budget crisis loop.
Right.
If we look back at the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash, state and local governments across the country were absolutely decimated.
Pension funds were suddenly facing massive, multi-billion-dollar deficits. Tax revenues had plummeted due to the recession, and critical infrastructure was crumbling.
At the same time, the dominant political climate had become fiercely anti-tax, meaning that raising revenue through traditional democratic means was viewed by politicians as instant career suicide.
This created a sprawling landscape of what one privatization financier bluntly referred to as desperate governments.
Desperate governments.
And desperate governments are the absolute best customers for private equity.
Firms like the Carlyle Group swooped into this void.
If you are a mayor staring down a massive pension shortfall and an angry electorate, the offer of a massive upfront cash payment in exchange for control of the city's water system or its parking meters looks like a miraculous lifeline.
It allows a politician to balance the budget for that specific fiscal year, boldly claim to their constituents that they didn't raise taxes, and quietly pass the long-term consequences onto the next administration.
The degraded service, the loss of control, the higher consumer fees, all kicked down the road.
It's the political equivalent of sweeping dirt under a rug that won't be lifted for 75 years. During that era, one mayor was even quoted as saying, "Water is the new oil."
That tells you everything you need to know about how aggressive the feeding frenzy was among private investors.
But there is a second feedback loop that is arguably even more insidious than the budget crises, the loop of lobbying and institutional erosion.
Yes.
When a government outsources a public service, let's say they privatize a city's environmental testing labs or its complex IT infrastructure, they don't just lose control of that specific service.
They actually lose the internal expertise and the public sector capacity to do that work.
Hollowing out the state.
Exactly. This is a phenomenon often referred to as hollowing out the state. Over time, the public agency becomes tangibly less capable of performing complex tasks.
The experienced personnel, the engineers, the analysts either retire or they move over to the private contractors where the salaries are heavily subsidized by the very contracts the government just signed.
And because the government is now demonstrably less capable and lacks internal expertise, the proponents of privatization can point to this weakened, hollowed-out state as proof that the government is inefficient.
Which, of course, then justifies even more outsourcing.
It is a perfectly engineered, self-fulfilling prophecy of state failure.
And it gets worse. Because the private companies that win these lucrative public contracts take the massive profits they made from the taxpayers, and they use that exact same money to lobby the government for more privatization.
They fund sympathetic think tanks, they hire legions of politically connected lobbyists, and in some cases, they literally write the legislation that regulates their own industries.
They have, as the research calls it, skin in the game.
And we must recognize that their policy preferences inevitably conflict with the broader public good.
We see this acutely in environmental policy, where public goals often clash directly with private profit motives. Take the case of the Indianapolis incinerator.
Yes, the Covanta contract.
The city of Indianapolis entered into a public-private partnership with a private corporation called Covanta to run a massive waste-to-energy incinerator. The contract they signed included a deeply problematic clause known as a put-or-pay provision.
This clause legally guaranteed the company that the city would deliver 300,000 tons of trash to the incinerator every single year to burn for fuel.
Let's just pause and think about the perverse incentive that creates.
The private incinerator literally needs garbage to survive and hit its profit margins.
But the citizens of Indianapolis wanted to increase their recycling programs. They wanted to be more environmentally sustainable, to compost more, to throw less away.
But the contract explicitly stated that if the city didn't deliver the required 300,000 tons of trash, they would be heavily penalized.
The outcome was bizarre but entirely predictable given the mechanics.
The city was actually forced to pay up to $4 million a year in penalties to the corporation, simply because the citizens were recycling too much and not producing enough garbage to feed the private incinerator.
So if I'm a citizen in Indianapolis, diligently washing out my plastic containers and putting them in the recycling bin because I want to help the environment, my civic action is actually costing my city millions of dollars in fines.
That is madness.
It really is.
This raises an important question. Who is actually governing Indianapolis in that scenario?
It's not the elected city council, and it's certainly not the voting public.
The governing authority is the contract. Democratic decision-making regarding environmental policy is completely displaced by the financial requirements of the private operator.
And we see similar persistence and fierce resistance to public control in the water sector. You mentioned the Carlyle Group earlier.
Yes.
Through a subsidiary called Park Water, they gained control of the water system in Apple Valley, California. Over a 13-year period, despite severe droughts and admirable conservation efforts by the citizens to use less water, the private company relentlessly raised water rates by 68%.
Why? Because regardless of the drought, the private equity firm was boasting a 12% annual profit expectation to its institutional investors.
The profit had to be extracted, regardless of the environmental reality.
And what happens when a community realizes they've made a mistake and tries to get their public good back?
It is incredibly hard to reverse these deals once the ink is dry.
Look at the city of Missoula, Montana. They spent years and millions of taxpayer dollars fighting the Carlyle Group in court.
They eventually had to use the extreme measure of eminent domain just to force the private equity firm to sell them their own water system back.
They eventually won the fight, but they had to pay over $83 million to do it.
It shows the monumental, exhausting struggle required to pry a public good back out of private hands once the corporate legal architecture is in place.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this persistence, the fact that these deals keep happening despite the obvious systemic dysfunctions, isn't just an accident of bad contracting or a few naive mayors.
The sources explicitly trace this back to a highly organized, long-term political ideology that began gaining massive traction during the 1980s.
The architects of this movement understood a basic political reality. The public generally likes their local public schools, they like their national parks, and they rely on their public firefighters.
You cannot run a successful political campaign on the platform of taking those popular things away. You would be voted out of office immediately.
Right. If you knock on a voter's door and say, vote for me, I'm going to sell the bridge you drive onto an Australian investment bank, they are going to slam the door in your face.
So the ideology had to adapt. The research highlights a founder of a prominent libertarian think tank who literally described their strategy as dismantling the state step by step.
It was a deliberate, quiet, bureaucratic coup.
Privatization provided the perfect mechanism. It allowed politicians to cut the size of the government workforce on paper, which satisfied the anti-government ideological wing while simply outsourcing the exact same work to private corporations.
It's a stealthy way to dismantle public power without having to directly confront your constituents and tell them you're cutting their services.
And we must emphasize, based on our source material, that this was not a purely right-wing phenomenon. Over the decades, it evolved into a deeply entrenched bipartisan consensus.
This push for privatization is nested within a broader macroeconomic ideology, often referred to as neoliberalism, coupled heavily with the hyper-financialization of public assets.
Neoliberalism, broadly speaking, is the belief that market exchange is an ethic in itself, capable of acting as a guide for all human action, and that the state's role should be limited to protecting private property rights and creating markets where none previously existed.
Both major political parties in the U.S. heavily adopted this framework.
Yes, the sources make a strong point of highlighting the Clinton administration's Reinventing Government initiative in the 1990s. The explicit stated goal of that initiative was to create a customer service contract with the American people.
Again, listen to that specific language, customer service.
On the surface, it sounds great. It sounds efficient, responsive, and modern.
But structurally, it fundamentally redefines the relationship between the individual and the state. You are no longer a citizen endowed with civic duties, a shared destiny, and constitutional rights. You are merely a customer of the state, looking for the best deal.
This ideological shift permeates everything. It influences our media narratives and even reshapes our justice system. Consider the pervasive maker versus taker narrative that dominates so much political discourse.
This framework artificially divides society into hardworking taxpayers who make and dependent welfare recipients who take.
It completely obscures the macroeconomic reality that public benefits from unemployment insurance to public education to infrastructure are public goods that stabilize the entire economy.
A functioning society relies on profound interconnectedness, but the privatization narrative isolates us into competing economic units, suspicious of anyone who accesses a public good we feel we paid for.
And this isolation, this reduction of the citizen to a mere contracting entity, reaches its absolute terrifying peak when we look at the justice system itself. The sources bring up a major landmark Supreme Court case, Epic Systems.
This case dealt directly with the explosion of forced arbitration clauses.
I'm sure anyone listening to this has experienced this. Have you ever signed an employment contract or just mindlessly clicked accept on the terms of service for a new software update? And buried on page 40 of the fine print is a clause saying you agree to settle any disputes in private arbitration rather than in a public court of law.
That mechanism is the literal privatization of the civil justice system.
In the Epic Systems case, the court ruled that these forced arbitration clauses embedded in employment contracts can essentially override a worker's right to engage in collective legal action, a right that was supposedly guaranteed by long-standing federal labor laws.
It's astounding. The court basically elevated the right of contract above nearly all other constitutional rights.
As a citizen of a democracy, you theoretically have the right to a public trial, the right to transparency, and the right to band together with your peers in collective action.
But the moment you become a private employee who signs a contract, and let's be real, you often have to sign that contract as a mandatory non-negotiable condition just to get the job and feed your family, you have essentially signed away your access to the public justice system.
You are forced into a private, corporate-funded arbitration room. The rules in that room are inherently skewed in favor of the employer who hired the arbitrator. There is no public record of the proceedings, and everything is kept entirely secret.
It is the ultimate expression of the systemic transfer we've been discussing for the last hour. The private contract becomes king, superseding democratic rights.
Privatization, which is endlessly sold to the public as a method for expanding consumer choice and increasing administrative efficiency, actually functions as an aggressive mechanism for restricting fundamental rights and funneling disputes into unaccountable private venues.
So looking at all these sources, pulling together the economics, the infrastructure deals, the public health failures, and the legal battles.
What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis in perception is a multi-layered, highly effective illusion that has been carefully constructed over the last several decades.
Let's break down the layers.
First, the public is falsely encouraged to view privatization simply as an administrative tweak. We are told over and over that it is just about efficiency, finding a faster, cheaper way to pave a highway, run a prison cafeteria, or manage a call center.
In reality, a systems-level analysis reveals that privatization is a massive, structural transformation of power. It is the literal transfer of sovereignty from a democratic, publicly accountable body to private, profit-driven corporate boards.
Second, the illusion relies heavily on the pervasive language of consumer choice. This language is actively used to obscure the loss of democratic accountability.
When you are a consumer, your only real power is the power to buy or not buy. You have no structural say in how the product is made, what it actually costs the environment, or who gets excluded from having it.
But when you are a citizen, you possess a voice in the creation, regulation, and ultimate control of the system itself. Privatization trades your democratic voice for a menu of pre-selected, profit-driven options.
Third, our public debates are constantly and intentionally misdirected. We argue endlessly about performance failures, a poorly run private prison, a disastrous rollout of a privatized state website, or a wildly delayed toll road project.
But framing the debate purely around performance misses the deeper institutional redesign taking place. Even a well-run private water system that successfully extracts a 15% profit from a community is a failure of democratic design, because it means the public has lost sovereignty over its own vital environment and its own capital.
And finally, the ultimate crisis in perception is the slow, insidious conditioning of the public psyche itself. We are being conditioned to accept our own redefinition.
We are being stripped of our identity as citizens with reciprocal civic duties, people who recognize that our fates are linked, that public health is collective, that we share a common good.
Instead, we're being trained to view ourselves as isolated market participants, competing against each other for basic survival in a landscape increasingly owned by investment banks.
That structural breakdown brings us right back to the grand tension we set up at the very beginning of this deep dive.
There is a fundamental, unavoidable incompatibility between democratic governance and market-based institutional design. Democratic governance, at its core, requires universal access, equity, and transparency.
It dictates that no matter how much money you have in your pocket, you have a fundamental right to clean water, safe roads, and public health.
But market-based design inherently requires exclusion, rivalry, and profit extraction. You simply cannot optimize a system for a 20% return to Wall Street and simultaneously optimize it for the universal welfare of a community. The math simply does not work.
It requires a massive paradigm shift in how we view our institutions. It requires us to stop asking the narrow market-driven question of how can we make this service profitable and start asking the democratic question, what are the public goods required for our society to thrive, and how do we ensure democratic control over them?
If the underlying fabric of our society continues to be rewritten from democratic rights into private contracts, what happens when the very concept of "we" is completely contractualized? If citizenship is reduced to a subscription service, what happens to the people whose subscriptions expire? It's something to chew on the next time you pay a toll or your water bill or blindly accept the terms and conditions of a new app. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoyed this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.